We're out here today on one of our large impoundments in southeastern Australia, chasing large wintertime Murray cod. And it's where I designed this fly for a lot of this style of fishing. So the gear that we like to use with this style of fly and a lot of our big fly work is a 9 or 10 weight rod. And one of the key components is our actual line. So we're running, basically all the manufacturers now have what we call an integrated shooting head style line. So they're very aggressive front taper lines, very easy loading lines, and they just make the big fly work a little bit easier. So even though we've designed that fly so it's castable on a range of rods and gear, we still like to optimize our equipment to help us out on the day. And as far as reels, to be honest, it doesn't really matter. We're not chasing fish that are going to run hard, fast like we might see in salt water. Definitely a good idea though, reel wise, is maybe pick a reel that's light. Often by having a lighter setup all day, like it doesn't matter if we're down here chasing Murray cod or fish like pike or muskie in the northern hemisphere, you're going to be doing a lot of repetitive casting through the day. So if you can lighten up that setup, it's going to just feel better through the hand and have you ready to go when it comes time to hook a fish. To help us out even more to turn over these large flies, we've got a very simply constructed leader here. These fish are large, and I know it's hard to physically break heavy lines through a fly rod, but we use heavier tippet for two reasons down here. And that is, one, for abrasion resistance. If we hook that fish tight to cover, or it turns and runs us back into the timber, it buys us a bit of time. I'm not too stressed about mono or fluorocarbon. If given a choice, I would lean towards fluorocarbon purely for its abrasion resistance. And it does sink well through the water as well, so can stabilise that fly a little bit in the water. Whatever your preferred loop knot is, that's a lefty's loop knot. I don't think it really matters, but yeah, learn a good loop knot, and that just gives that fly nice free range of movement on the end of our leader. So yeah, that's literally 5 feet a leader, maybe a little bit more. And it's just split half-half. So a perfection loop, which forms our loop to our loop on our fly line, and then I like a double blood knot. You can run any of your joining knots, and then literally the same amount, maybe a little bit longer in tippet material. So that leader is purely constructed out of 60 pound, quite a stiff 60. This one down to a 40 pound. So we like to fish 40 or 30 pound tippet typically. So even though we've designed this fly so it's fairly easy to cast for such a large fly, there's still some tips that are going to help you greatly with any of your big fly work. I find one of the biggest tips is that the human brain tends to want to over muscle things and speed things up a lot. So when I'm showing people how to do a lot of this work, I just purely get them to slow down. By slowing down, working on good smooth acceleration of that rod through the air, you pretty much nearly feel that big fly almost tug at the end of your casting stroke. That way you know that line has fully straightened out on the backstroke, and then it's ready to bring forward again. By doing that, well, basically by reversing that around, if our timing's a little bit out and we haven't pretty much exaggerated that pause on the back cast, what's going to happen is that large fly is not that aerodynamic. Doesn't matter how well we construct it. Just a little bit of slack in the system will cause it to crumple over, and it really does a number on your casting stroke. So just remember that. That's probably my biggest tip. That being said, the one thing you don't really want to do, and I harp on about this a lot through just fishing generally, doesn't matter if we're chasing trout or a cod, we don't want to get in a situation where we're false casting a lot. That's when your timing's really, if you've got any errors with your timing, that's really gonna become apparent. So if you can, pick up and just pop it down, no more than 2 false casts. Not only is that a much more efficient way to cover the water, but it also means that at the end of the day, when you've been casting all day, waiting for that bite from that big trophy-sized fish, you're still gonna have energy. If you spend the day aimlessly false casting around, then you're just gonna tire yourself out. So it's a matter of fishing that fly all the way back to the rod tip where you can see it, and then just slip a little bit of line out through the air, back, forward, back, and then pop it down. You'll also notice that I like to run my line through my fingers. That means that if I haven't quite got a nice tight connection going forward, I can just cheat a little bit. And as that line shoots out, I can actually, I'll show you what I mean, shoot it out, I can grab it and just pull that, use the weight of the fly to pull that line tight. The other thing that lets me do too, when we're fishing in a lot of situations for cod, we're actually fishing really close to structure. So it means that I can stop that fly line and fly right where I want it, nice and tight to that log. So it's a really good tip, and that's a good tip anywhere where accuracy is required. So just remember that one. So another great cast to learn with this heavy fly works, one that we call the waterhaul cast. So we just do that again. Literally I'll finish my retrieve, roll a bit of line out onto the surface, let that fly sink momentarily, and I'm going to use that resistance to load the rod and then shoot forward. That's even cut out another false cast, so it's made me even more efficient out there on the water. Now we're just going to cover a few basic retrieves that we really like to use with this fly. So we've got a fly that basically kicks side to side as well as has a bit of an undulating action up and down. Now, one of our first choices is working out where we think the fish are sitting in the water column. One thing we find with Murray cod is they've got their eyes on top of their head. So they're a predatory fish that can feed from the bottom all the way to the top of the water column. So even though we might be fishing for these fish in 4 and 5 meters of water, a lot of the time, or as shallow as 1/2 meter, sometimes even for big fish, it doesn't necessarily mean, even when we're in those deeper bits of water, that we need a super fast sinking line. So to give you an idea, out here today on the water, we're running an intermediate line on one rod and a sink 3 on the other. So that 3 gets down to about 3 to 5 inches per second, and the intermediate's going to be a bit less than that, so about 3 to 2.5 inches per second. Now, that sinking line's great though, because it stabilizes the fly in the water and lets us fish through the water column. So if I know I'm casting up onto a shallow bank, I might lay my cast out. This is a pretty typical situation all around the world for all sorts of fish, and I'm going to fish that fly straight away. Now, when I know that I've come down off that depth change, I'm going to pause the retrieve. It's amazing how often that pause in the retrieve elicits a response from the fish. The other thing that we're doing is we're fishing our way down the gradient. So that fly sinks down and we can bring it back out again. Now, your fish might be different back home, but we find with Murray cod that a lot of time they'll hit it on the pause. So we might incorporate a few pauses into the retrieve. And it's amazing how often just that change of pace from that fly going through the water fairly uniformly to a pause, sinks briefly for a second or two, and then bang, that's often when you get the hit. Now, that retrieve that I'm doing now, just a draw. It's almost, I like to call it the rip pause. So it's a rip pause, and see I'm keeping that line in my hands, and I've always got contact on that line. So rip pause. I can do that a little bit faster. A little bit faster means that fly is going nicely for me, and then I can pause it, or I can do a rip and it kicks up, pauses, will drift off to one side, and then another rip, and then it's going to go again out the other side. It's often for me a variation on that rip pause. That being said, sometimes we might want another retrieve that works well is almost like a saltwater style or a roly-poly for the stillwater trout fishermen. So tuck that rod under your arm and just bring it in like this. Now what that does is it means that fly really swims nicely. So some days it might be about mixing up that retrieve and just till you get one that the fish want. So that retrieve there is very similar to a lure fisherman's presentation. So keep that in mind. Maybe your buddy throwing lures is doing better than you with that rip pause retrieve on your fly rod, and they might be just doing what they call a slow roll. So we can do that as well with the fly. Just tick it under your arm and just bring it in. If you're in saltwater, you might use this retrieve to go a lot quicker. We're using it here purely just to get that fly to come back at a nice pace. One more retrieve that we like to use a lot, and for me it's come from both guiding and fishing conventional a bit over the years as well. It's a I like to call it a bump of the rod tip. So we're basically going to use the tip of the rod to impart action on the fly. And when I say we get action out of the fly, this is how we get the real side to side, almost what's called a walk to dog action out of the fly under the water. So basically we're always fishing nice and low to the surface of the water so we can get a positive hook set. In this instance though, we're just going to bump that rod tip up 3, 4, maybe 5 inches, but as we bump up, we're taking the slack up, and then that rod tip's coming down between each strip as well. That way we know that we're going to be able to make a positive hook set on that fish when we get a bite. So it's a matter of just low and just bump the tip of the rod. Pop, pop. Always taking up that slack line through your hand. It's a retrieve that can work all depths of the water column. I really like it sinking deep down into the depths, and just a couple of bumps and then pause again, and it can often get a response out of a fish. Always be ready for that take on the pause in the retrieve as well. Because we've now tied a fly that's got a lot of inherent movement in it, it's important to know too that you may lay a nice cast out and just let that fly, or you want to let it get to depth a bit more in the spot that you're in before you start your retrieve. Make sure you're nice and tight on that and everything's ready to go. The reason is that because as that fly drops, those materials are already wafting and kicking under their own power. So you might get that strike as that fly drops through the water. So be ready. If you get that hit, be ready to nice strip strike to set the hook. And remember, it's all about the strip strike with this style of fishing. If we lift that rod trout style, we're going to lose our fish, and that can be a bit of a heartbreaking moment when you've been out there all day waiting for that one fish. And if you lift that rod trout style, yeah, it can be a little bit hard to take, to be honest. So just remember, nice, you feel that fish bite and inhale, jam that hook home with a nice strip strike. Now, I know that when I've got anglers on my boat that are ready to tangle with one of these fish, because we're fishing tight to timber a lot of the day, because especially during the day when the sun's up like it is now, those fish tuck back into their snags and rest out the day. So we're trying to get a response from a fish in that spot. I know that the anglers on the boat, and I do it myself too, that you're like a mouse trap. You're ready to go off at any time, and if you feel that fly, basically you know that you got the right mindset, that if you do feel a log and you set that hook into that timber, it doesn't matter. Like we want people to get hooked up in logs each day, because I know that they're fishing in the right areas. So by all means, practice the strip strike when you're fishing around timber, when you hit a snag. That way you know that you're ready to play the game. So we're going to keep going here this afternoon, throwing these flies at large Murray cod, and hopefully we connect with one. If you feel that you've got a situation where a fly like Mr. Twitchy would work well, by all means, go and get them and source the materials, sit down, learn how to tie it, follow the step-by-steps that we did. It's a fly that I know will fill a lot of voids around the world for situations with big predatory fish.